Welcome. Welcome to the studio tonight. It is me, your dungeon father, here to simply speak about what is to come in this light, so to speak. The idea of what we will be doing here is we will be focusing on the tales of old, the idea of things that have happened and that continue to shape the world around us. The idea here is we will be talking more about the stories that have been written before in my years of doing this, and then looking even further into how things go. What I would like to do with all of you here and everything that's going on is essentially create a better place to hear stories and to kind of feel out what it is you're looking for. That's really all it comes down to, is essentially the line of what you like to hear. This all started because I was essentially uh, given, basically told to put more faith in people wanting to hear my stories than what was originally given beforehand. And excuse the glitching behind me. The system seems to be being unfun for me today. So there's one story we're going to be starting with that I hope those who wish to come and listen do so. We will be starting with a very simple story raised from the bones of the old. This story is the fall of the twin spires, and it takes place in a old kingdom built on the carcass of another. Funny things about the bones of a story is that they can lead to other directions and interpretations of the situation you find yourself in. In this case, in the story of Twin Spires, laid the groundwork for not only the ideas of what befell the land that came after, but also the heroes that led the charge to break the siege. This place takes place in our own world, in the sense of the campaign where the story was first written happened 15 years ago. It was a long time ago, with a very young dungeon father behind the screen. I also was not the one telling the story at that point in time. That was another person. For in this case, we'll call him Jay. Jay was a friend of my uncle who I learned to play from. Was a wonderful individual who told wonderful stories. They had been doing their own games for multiple decades before I had come around. Now, this story started in a world. The world did not have much of a name, minus what the events had transpired had given it. It had kingdoms that spanned for miles. It had roads that cut through swaths of mountain and forests like knives. But the one kingdom that was important was one called Moor's Hill. A small village off the northeastern coast of the Blackened Sea laid this city that was both primitive and advanced, to say the least. The idea of Moores Hill was to be a center point for commerce, a center point for those who wish to go forward, be more. In Moores Hill, there was a small tavern. The tavern laid bare across the square that it sat on. At the very north point of this large circle with a large stone fountain in the center that was filled with copper and silver, laid by the hands of travelers in the sense of good luck and good passing. Those that walked past and went into the tavern were usually found to only simply find food and drink to satisfy their needs. Otherwise, those that went in were given the opportunity to possibly become something more. If you were feeling adventurous, the boards offered many a job. Otherwise, you could always speak to the bartender, as it is always said in the taverns we see in today's fashion. Now, let us speak plainly. What we find in Moores Hill is not simply what was found then, but what was soon to be found in the days to come. In the days to come was many a thing that would be following through and would be causing quite a stir, if you will, along those that wished to be a part of the larger process. The biggest issue that they would see as the world would continue pushing forward was the fact that the number of heroes was decreasing. The number of problems was increasing. It was hard to tell who was helping what and if anything was actually being done correctly. Now, why am I being blurred? Don't know why this is all happening at this point. Alright, computer, fine. We'll play it this way. Don't even know why I have a chair on the screen. So, in Moores Hill is the tavern. The tavern was called the Boar's Head. A typical name used by typical individuals that wanted to start a house upon a hill, or a tavern that simply brought in the coin and the ale and stories that made their place grow. Inside the tavern was a number of interesting individuals. A few that would make note of what exactly you were looking for. There was the twin dwarves, that being thieves were well known for stealing what coin they had. You had the half-elf ranger. You had the half-tiefling, or what essentially was tiefling in 2nd edition, wizard. You had, of course, the barbarian and the druid. You had a number of interesting and well-built characters in this room, as they all simply sat in a tavern, as it always does. And in came a young man, a young human, a fighter, looking to sharpen his teeth, to cut his teeth, if you will, against the world that he seemed to see that was full of problems. His name was Ian McCallan. He was a young greenhorn, as they called it. Well-spirited, not very skilled. He focused on growing as a person. He was hoping that his time as an adventurer would allow him to grow further than anything else that he had seen before. But what he didn't know is that he was going to be in for the ride of a lifetime. He would fulfill his idea of growing. He would fulfill his understanding of what it is meant to be a true fighter and a soldier, to grow and mature. And it all starts with the infamous events of the twin spires of the northeastern wastes. Thank you for the biddies, Miss Carson. It is greatly appreciated. At the point of the twin spires, Ian would have gained a number of years under his belt traveling with this party. The idea of him fighting with these individuals and growing as a person was paramount, no matter what he found himself dealing with. On the beginning, on his first few adventures, they would come across a number of issues he believed himself to be too young for, too inexperienced. Following behind the wizard and the barbarian, he found himself learning much more than what he could as just going on his own or being a regular mercenary. The first place that they were brought to was simply known as the Tomb of the Snake. The Tomb of the Snake was a misleading title, as there were no snakes in the tomb. The idea was that it was raised and created by a ruler who deemed himself the lord of such reptilian danger noodles. His plan to essentially use them to his best advantage. To have his assassins use poisons and venoms to strike down the enemies that he comes across. As he grew in age, they found that the king was, in the lack of a better term, crazy, insane. And so eventually a rebellion rose up, smited him, and brought him down a few pegs, so to speak. They buried him in the tomb that he had created to hide his secrets of the assassins that he had created. And that is the tomb where Ian found himself with the rest of the party he stood with. This party, before he arrived, was a group of 6 individuals, all experienced adventurers, with him having none. So walking into a place called the Tomb of Snakes was not on the top of his list of things to do. But unfortunately, he went forward, and he pushed. As he entered the dungeon, the other party members moving forward in front of him, he began learning of what they looked for and how and why. Being curious, he always put his ear to the ground. He, at an earlier point, found himself arrogant. Morning, Mr. Joe. He found himself arrogant. He found himself in a position of believing he knew everything. After a time, he soon realized that he did not. He found that arrogance is what gets you killed. He saw this after a royal tried to fight a knight. The royal who believed himself to be more or in better skills than the knight that served his father. The royal was simply put down easily by the knight without ever drawing his sword, simply showing that boasting means nothing. Actions mean everything. And even when all is right, all can still be wrong. And Ian kept that lesson for a long time. And so as he started watching the party travel through the dungeon, looking for traps, loose stones, wires, a misplaced vase, all things that would point towards a problem, an issue, a hazard. They continued down into the Tomb of Snakes. The resistance was not much to really worry about. It was a couple of skeletons, maybe a couple of ghouls and a ghast. Nothing that this party of advanced adventurers could deal with. Ian tried his best to keep up. Being a few years behind them, he had a bit of a gap to fill, let's say. So, seeing that they knew that he was going to be falling behind, they pushed through the tomb. They eventually found their way through a number of smaller enemies that meant not much to even the barbarian who simply swatted them aside like rolling stacks of meat. A simple push opening up the way. Appreciate it, Rexus. The party continued pushing. At the very end, they came across something they wish they hadn't. They came across a beast from another plane, one that tends to plan, but this one, its intelligence had already gone. The smell of rotting flesh had filled the room to such a degree that it caused Ian to retch along with some of the other less constituted individuals of the party. And what they found themselves in front of was a beholder that had fallen to whatever disease or curse brings forth the undead specters of this world. So they had a zombie beholder to deal with. Unlike regular beholders, they don't have their intelligence, to an extent. But because they're undead, they have a few other abilities they can use, besides the normal. A fight breaks out. Ghouls and ghast begin to crawl the walls, summoned by the zombie beholder who has taken root in this dungeon. Axes are swung, swords are thrusted, spears thrown, and eventually it comes down to the beholder and the party. Ian at this point had taken a few of the ghouls and ghast down. Doing his best and doing his job, he protected the casters and let the other fighters go forward that could do more damage in close combat. So he sat back and he watched. He fought off a couple of zombies, nothing that he hasn't done before in his years of adventuring, but still feeling lackluster. It wasn't until the barbarian swung at the beholder, and swinging with such ferocity, he took off one of its eye stalks. In a feat of wisdom or in a feat of chance, it happened. The eye stalk flew off the beholder, hitting the ground with a sickening splat, as something shiny bounced off the eye stalk and rolled towards Ian's feet. The shiny object that rolled to his feet that he sees is a ring. Why it was on the eye stalk of a zombie beholder is unbeknownst and unconsequential, as Ian asked that question many a times to no answer, whether from his gods or from the party. So he decided what every adventurer does when it comes to finding new loot. Put it on. And so he put the ring on. The ring itself was a silver band with blackened markings around the outside. Small sunken skulls carved into the silver, but nothing intricate laid here, just a simple ring with simple decorations. When he put the ring on, he felt different. He felt 3 pulls on his mind. 3 different directions, 3 different intensities. They all pointed him out of the tomb and then across the countryside. Not exactly sure why or why all of a sudden he's feeling it. He felt that it was a call to action, a call to danger, a call to fight. Being the young buck he is, and being a fighter as well, he believed himself to do that. He had to go where the evil was. If he wasn't doing his job smiting the evil that roamed across this land, what was he doing with his life? Because as you know, listeners, adventurers are not brought forth by people who have normal lives. If you can't sit back and look at all the characters you've made, and you can't find a speck of trauma inside of them, those aren't your characters. That's just the facts of your face. I'm not saying that every character needs to have a tragic backstory, but you don't see regular people going and becoming adventurers. It's always the weird ones that go do it. I'm looking at you, Rexus. You got a couple of goofy ones, but I'm here for it. But past that point, Ian puts on the ring and feels the pull. He feels the need to go and fight. The party asks him about the ring as he asks them. No one has any clue. The wizard tries to identify it to no avail, which is strange given of how powerful they had become. Even the thieves had a hard time of identifying the ring, not able to find a maker's mark or any kind of discernible detail. And what was weirder is that when Ian took the ring off for them to look at it, when they would look away, it reappeared back on his hand. Every time. They walked across the entirety of the room. It reappeared. They put a wall between them, along with people. Still happened. It was something magical about it. Or a curse. Who's to say? So they set off. Ian, now having a feel of the three directions of these three different calls to action, talks to the party about where they should go next. At this point, he has not been in charge of any contracts or any kind of dealings they have gone into. It has been taken care of by the older members of the party, those that they deem themselves essentially the pseudo-leaders, the ones that have been around longest, that have made the best decisions. And so they decided to give Ian a break and say, sure, you can pick where we go. You've shown that you aren't going to die anytime soon, so pick a direction. And so he does. The first pull that pulls them is going southwest towards a town called Broken Crater. A strange name for a town, since it was neither broken nor crater. The party believed that they had misspelled the sign. It was supposed to be Broken Cradle. The townspeople believed that it was meant to be Rockin' Cradle. The answer was never given, and unfortunately, I don't think ever truly will. They found themselves in this town. They began looking for what Ian was talking about, what he wished to find. Fortunately, they didn't find anything in this town, as it seemed pretty boring. No goblins, no necromancers, no ghouls, no thieves, even no solicitors, no unwanted knife salesmen, or unwanted adventurers that are trying to steal all of your ale and women. None of it. It was very boring. That led them to understand that this was not the place they were looking for. So they moved through. They found there was a simple job for a bounty of dealing with some goblins, and they did so. The goblins went down as easy as a nice cherry pie on the 4th of July on a nice, cool summer evening with a big ol' scoop of vanilla ice cream on top of it. They went down smooth. Just as if you could throw a rock and take out a number of them in a single swing. Past that point, once they found themselves outside of the town after dealing with the goblins that had seen fit to cause a ruckus while they were present, the audacity of the small green-skinned monsters to believe that causing such a ruckus would alleviate them from whatever ailment they believed themselves to have. But they didn't realize that it would bring them closer to finding out what's on the other side of the light bar, because a barbarian threw them into a rock faster than a major league pitcher throwing a fastball. With the goblins defeated, the party moved on. Simple. Easy. It seemed simple enough. They moved to another larger city, this time closer to the south, as the call for combat, for saving, for action still rang in Ian's mind, 3 directions being clearly put to understanding in what he had. And so they moved. They marched. The next town they went to, they seemed to be closer to what they were looking for. Something closer to what Ian had felt. This town was not boring. There was a lot going on. A lot of bazaars, such as people selling goods. A lot of under-the-table dealings. Merchants that you believe may not be peddling such honest goods in their time standing there. It became very clear that this city was full of the things that Ian was looking for. And so he continued. They found themselves in a general store. Next door, a magic shop. Ian could not tell you what he was looking for or why. He could only tell you that it was supposed to be here. Again, why he believed it to be here is unbeknownst to the party and himself. All he knows is that he's supposed to be in this area of the city. As they continued exploring, they found there was a number of issues. There were people stealing, people breaking into the shops. And through a very complicated set of events, they found themselves becoming the new night guards of the magic shop. All 7 of them. A little bit overkill for a shop that is rarely visited during the daytime, let alone during the night. So, they did their job. They stood watch. Walked through the store, checked the windows, checked the doors. Turn the keys and jingle the locks, as it says. And everything seemed satisfactory. Till the sound of breaking glass came through the back of the store. The thieves were the ones that stayed inside, the twin dwarves. They were the ones first to investigate. They went to take a look at what exactly had occurred, of what had come through the window at such a speed, and they found that it was simply a brick. As they got closer to take a look at why the brick had fallen, they found that there was an arm reaching through the now broken glass, trying to find a handle. What they could tell from the arm is that the stature of the person reaching in was not as tall as they had wished, that the person trying to reach for the door handle, the doorknob, if you will, was much shorter than they had anticipated. Which unfortunately then begs the question of why do they believe that robbing a magic store is the best idea? Well, we'll let you think of that one as we go forward. So the thieves wait. The twin dwarves simply sit on their hands and wait, watching this person flail their arm inside the broken glass window trying to find the doorknob. Eventually they do so. Unbeknownst to them at this point, the dwarves had brought in the rest of the party to kind of stand in the store, as it had become quite amusing to watch this individual simply reach over and try to jiggle the knob in such a furious fashion as to not really make much progress until they lucked out. Almost as if by chance. So, the door opens. Behind the door, from the outside, mind you, were those that wished to break their way in. Thank you, Mr. Rage. Appreciated, good sir. Welcome in. Welcome to the story time. Behind the door, as the thieves finally made their way inside, to a darkened room full of cabinets and curiosities, unbeknownst of the party that laid in wait, watching quietly. something that is difficult for most parties to do. They saw that it was an elf, a halfling, and something along the lines of what looked like a dwarf but could have easily been a hobbit. And of course, Mr. Rage is quite alright. You are here. That is what counts. So they saw this halfling, this hobbit, and this elf enter the room. No one dare breathe heavily as to not ruin the moment of surprise. And then all at once, the party descended upon these thieves as they waited for them to simply pull what they were looking for. As the party did not know much of the value, minus the wizard, of the magical things in here, but the party had their own ulterior motives of what they would like for payment afterwards, so what better way to scope out what's valuable than by letting some other thieves, in a serendipitous way, check out the merchandise. So the thieves did just that. They walked up and down the cabinets, unknowing of the party that laid in wait, until they came across one that seemed to be locked behind the door by a glass pane. Inside was a black and silver tome, a grimoire, if you will, as it had a simple leather lock on it, or locking strap on it, and had symbolage of skulls and thorned wreaths that ran around the border. The blackened field looked not made of simple cardstock. It seemed to have been pressed satin into the covers of this book, the pages yellowed and aged. The intruders went quick to work to unlock the case, becoming simple work for them as they've done this before. And they pulled out the book and they tried to pry it open. They put lockpicks into the cover of the book to see if they could remove the limitation of the strap so they could open it fully. No matter what they did, they could not get it fully open. Every lockpick they put in simply snapped. Every grunt and every curmudgeon as they tried to open it further by brute strength only seemed to cause the book to close tighter. Eventually, they seemed like they were ready to give up and started to look once again. The party eventually gets bored of waiting, as these thieves don't seem very good at their job. The only thing they've taken so far was but a singular book, and a book that they can't even tell how expensive it is from just looking at it. So, the party, now bored out of their minds, simply descends upon the intruders, putting themselves in front, behind, and to the side of them, stopping them inside one of the aisles. Interrogations ensue, intimidation rolls are made, and no information is gained. The party had hoped to discover a ring of thieves, or possibly something else that would bring some excitement to their mediocre visit to this city, and they got nothing but the book that was taken from the case. Now, this is where things become split responsibility. The rogue of the party decided that we could give the book back, or we could take it as payment. If it's expensive, we could use it or sell it to get better gear. Ian and the rest of the party disagreed that there is still a code of ethics. We were simply working for the shopkeeper. There was nothing of intensity that we were trying to do, minus the fact that we were just simply doing our jobs. The rogue disagreed, as they usually do. So, the party leader, the wizard, simply asked the rogue to go put the book back and lock the case behind them, to simply make things easier and to put everything back to the way it was. Unfortunately, The rogue simply pocketed the book and put a different one in its place in the cabinet and locked it, pulling the old switcheroo that we're all so very familiar with to get the book into the background. And so, having the book in hand, they just continued going with what they had. Nothing more to really do until the rogue brought out the book to look at it. It seemed to react to the ring that Ian wore. Sitting around the fire outside the city, bored out of their minds but slightly richer. The party just simply talked about what they're aiming for. Their end goal, uncertain. Their original villain that they were meant to vanquish, why they all formed a group in the first place, has been dead for many years. Ian just seemed to come along and was a part of their story for but a moment, it seemed. A moment in a long list of accomplishments that they had established. The book seemed to react. As the rogue handed the book to Ian, as the ring seemed to pull his hand towards it, touching it opened it, and flowed into Ian's mind a number of spells. A number of incantations, words, phrases, and such. Looking past that, Ian was taken aback by the situation at hand. As now, being someone who focused strictly on martial combat, on the ability to fight with his hands, now found himself with the ability to cast magic. To put it into context, and to give you a little bit of numbers behind it, the heroes that Ian traveled with were an equivalent in terms of level 14 2nd edition characters. Those characters in 3.5 or 5th edition, as some of you are familiar with, in 5th edition, at 14th level and 2nd, you're essentially still squishy as all get out. Compared to a 5e character, these people are godlike with what they can do. Just with the power scaling and what they have, both of ability and items and everything else they came across. Back then, D&D was a whole nother beastie compared to what it is now. Ian, unfortunately, was not even in the double digits when he joined the party. He was essentially a level 9 fighter, which, though is still very impressive for other games, and still something very strong, compared to these level 14 characters, he was but a drop in a bucket of what they could do. The wizard could cast down meteors, the barbarian could cleave through mountains, the thieves could disappear into the shadow, the rogue could cast spells, disappear and reappear almost through the fog itself, stealing both your coin and your life. The bard could make the sky rain with a word. It was a sight to see all these powerful people roaming together, and so Ian always felt like he was behind. This book now seemed to give him a little bit more of strength. He saw that now he could use shadow to his advantage to make shapes, weapons. Something that he would have to learn and embrace, but something that would at least give him an edge. And this would become important in the fights they would have ahead. Now, I won't bore you with the details of what happens between where he finds the book and where they go next. Through a number of combat scenarios, encounters, and long-winded travel, and bounties being had and feasts being done, they find themselves 6 months later and on the other side of the region, on the northeastern corner, near this place called the Deadwood. Outside the Deadwood was a city called the Drowned Stone. The Drowned Stone was a city that once stood above the water that was near it, the swamp that around it. Over time, the city sank, and the water rose. So, they went from being a dry, normal city to a very damp and drowned city. For those listening, moist, if you will. It was an unpleasant experience for those who lived in that city of the Drowned Stone. And unfortunately, the party now finds them here. Finds themselves among depressing, desolate citizens. People who trudge through water just to simply go to their house, to the bar, to their work, where water over their feet has become commonplace, where they've now been building their beds 6 inches taller off the ground than they originally did before, so that they could at least have a moment to not be wet around the ankles. Their chairs were taller, their tables were taller. Everyone seemed to be sitting a foot and a half off the ground at all times. Even their couches, their sitting chairs, were a foot or so off the ground. It was like trying to throw yourself into a stilted pillow. It was the worst. And so the party found themselves here, dealing with the uncomfortable construction of the IKEA furniture that now lived in this city, on top of the desolate and depressing individuals that lived here. They were told that the water began to rise many generations ago when the first mayor was elected. He became elected because he was good at his job. He seemed to know where everything was going to be all at the same time. He seemed to be in multiple places at once and be able to ask questions and stay in one place for longer than intended, so he could spread his good word to those that wished to listen. His one possession he never left with was a gold and silver pocket watch that had black enamel-filled designs on the back of it. It was weighted, but felt light in your hand, but cold to the touch, no matter the temperature outside or how long it's been in your pocket. It always ticked with a loud, ominous echo behind it. Not enough that you would notice unless you sat in the room alone with it. And it was something that this mayor had found when he was young, and he kept it with him ever since. It seemed to bring him good luck and gave him the ability to do more than he could ever dream of in a single lifetime. And then it all went to hell in the Drowned Stone when that mayor came to town. When he came to town was a prospect, he continued to move himself around and talk with people. He continued to converse and convey his thoughts, feelings, thoughts, and prayers to those around him, talking to them about the marsh and what it could be used for, about the waters that rise, about the deadwood that stands outside its borders, the purpose of the wood inside, to build better walls and better furniture. Unfortunately, it came to pass in such an instant that once he was elected, for some reason the pocket watch disappeared. They don't know where it went or why it went. All they know is that when the watch disappeared, the water began to rise. People say that if you go near the center of town, near a well, you can hear the very fast ticking of a clock, which coincidentally is in line with the fact that they have a clock in the middle of the town square that it happens to be near a well. So now the party believes that these people will be desolate, depressing, damp, moist, and annoying, but now crazy. Because now they believe they hear ticking from a place where there's already a clock. So they unfortunately have to decide where they're going to go. They have to find work to make pay. They have to find work to make their way to wherever they're going, wherever they're needed to go next. So they wait for the night. They sleep in tall, stilted beds on the floor levels of the inns, where the top floors have been filled with all the items that cannot be put on stilts. Which seems like a counterintuitive prospect if you ask me, but I don't live in the drowned stone. So they all sleep. Unfortunately for Ian, he cannot. He tries. He tosses and turns, but the humidity of the air, the lack of a feeling of dryness, the lack of feeling of not constantly hearing fish swimming by your bed woke him up from whatever sleep he thought he was going to have. And he found himself walking, trudging, if you will, through the water that came up to the bottom of his knees as he walked through the streets of the drowned stone. The sloshing of his boots as he walked, filling the air as everyone else had been fast asleep for quite some time. He was in awe of the fact of how well these individuals could sleep in a place as sorry and desolate as the drowned stone. He kept moving. He went towards the town square to see if maybe the townspeople were right. They were hearing a type of clicking or ticking from somewhere that wasn't the clock tower. As he got close to the town square, Ian could hear the tick, 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 tick of a clock somewhere. He did the one thing that apparently none of the townspeople thought was necessary, and simply looked up at the clock face. As he looked up, he saw a ruined and desolate ceramic clock face. 6 feet across, if you will. Long cast iron hands welded to the center post. It seemed to tell the time, but was off. But the one thing that gave it away was the fact that the second hand did not move. The ticking did not come from the tower. The only sound that came from the tower was a deep, harmonious notching of gears and the occasional bell toll on the hour. So he continued to investigate. He found that the ticking was not coming from the clock tower, as stated before, but from the well. And the ticking was fast. It was extremely fast-paced, going much, much quicker than anything he's heard before, as if you listen to a normal watch, it is a simple tick, tick, tick. The watch that Ian was listening to was something of that of a heartbeat when fear has a grip on your mind. Just tick, 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 echoing ever softly from the bottom of the well. So he began to look. He began to find it. He found that if he held his head close to the opening of the well, he could hear it down below. But there was no bucket, no rope, no way to get himself down there, except in a way that he deemed not intelligent. You see that over his time working with the rogues and the thieves of his party, he found that sometimes the improvised solutions are the best solutions. And so, in that point in time, he simply took 2 daggers out of his bag that he had gained and used it to simply gently, ever so gently, climb down the well. It felt like some time for him to climb. The dampness of his boots, the sloshing of the water that escaped into the leather, making it an uncomfortable experience, to say the least. He eventually made his way down, and he found that the well itself was dry, much like the levee that you drove to in your Chevy while you're drinking some rye. Now, unfortunately, since the well was dry, it meant that he could not find himself a drink, and he was not going to drink groundwater, as he at least has some standards. But at the bottom, he found that in the mouth of a man, or in this case, a skull, laid the pocket watch, snagged between the upper and lower teeth. The lower jaw now separated, the watch simply sat in the dirt below the skull. The bones of the body stained around it, buried by the sediment and time. The bones seemed rather older than they would have imagined. The ticking of the pocket watch keeping at its pace as Ian, looking closer, investigating the scene, found that the dirt itself seemed to rise around the bones, almost as if the dirt itself was growing. In an act of haste and an act of worry, Ian grabs the watch. He fiddles with it until he can finally find a way to slow the ticking. Unfortunately, on his first attempt, he makes the ticking go faster. And he begins to see the hair on his arm turn gray, his skin become wrinkled and withered, liver spots forming, the dirt beneath his feet growing still as the leather of his boots begins to age, the threads popping from dry rot. After a few more attempts in panic, he finds a way to slow the ticks. It's at that point that Ian searches within his own understanding of what the watch is meant to symbolize. For looking upon the face of the watch, where the hands sit, you can simply see that instead of the 12, there is a skull. Instead of the 3 is a silhouette of a child. At the 6, the silhouette of a man. And at the 9, the silhouette of an elderly man. The riddle that came to his mind of what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening. A human. Whereas the time is relevant to the age of the person. In this case, this watch was very specifically decorated to almost reflect that riddle. Whereas the number 12 was replaced by the skull, seemed to represent both death, life, and rebirth. Whether meaning time was cyclic or not was a philosophical question Ian was not going to tackle at that point in time. So he picks up the watch. Well, he puts it in his pocket, to be specific, as it was already in his hand. As he fixes the time frame of the watch, the ticking slowing, he sees his body somewhat return to normal. as if the time that had passed was fake, or was a magic that seemed to pass away rather quickly. As he made his way up the well, ever slowly, he climbed between the stones and through them, using the daggers as grips. He brought himself to the top, and as time had still not passed as much, possibly about 20-ish minutes or so, had passed since he went down into the well, he began to ask himself a question of, whose skeleton did I just find, and why was the watch in its mouth? He then remembered the story of the mayor, of how the old mayor remained in power. They admired the fact that he seemed to live for much longer than they anticipated, but the watch was missing. Ian began to speculate. He began to think. He began to question. One thing he questioned was the mayor the real mayor? That question was soon answered when he came face to face with the man himself. A bone-chilling grin across the man's face. Eyes wide open, pupils dilated. If his face was made of porcelain, the smile would have cracked it. The man simply looked over him and with an uneasy tone simply said, "Why were you in my well?" And we're going to take a break for a minute. I'm going to go grab my water bottle, my agua, if you will, and take a stretch. When we come back, we will continue. And we will talk about the fall of the Twin Spires and why Ian was the right hero in all the wrong places. So, we'll be back in a few. I will return. Welcome back, everyone. Did you all hydrate your flesh prisons while I was away? I did. I drank a lot of water, gave myself a good shake about the face to get myself back into the swing of what we're aiming for. So where we left off was Ian coming face to face with essentially someone who he believed to be the mayor, or was. Now no longer entirely sure if that is the case, he finds himself in a difficult position. At the long and short of it, he finds himself facing down something or someone that has made themselves the mayor, that has put themselves in a position of power, that has caused issues among the drowned stone. Ian, with the pocket watch in hand, simply thinks about what that means, of why this individual has put himself in such a position. As Ian goes to try and pull himself out of the well, putting his arms over the side, digging his feet into the footholds that he can find, the mayor simply puts his hands on his shoulder and puts weight against it. Not enough to push him in, but enough to keep him from getting all the way out. And simply looks at Ian's hand, seeing the silver chain that drapes out of it, and goes, "Give me the watch." Ian, in all simple cases, refuses with a few expletives and a few questions. Specifically, "Are you the mayor?" Which the creature responds with, "Yes, of course I am." "Are you the original mayor?" "But of course I am. Who else would I be?" The creature, continuing to eyeball the watch, keeping Ian from getting out of the well completely, leads to a split-second decision on both of their parts. Ian tries to scramble out of the well past the monster in front of him and fails. He does not push past the monster, and instead, the mayor simply pushes back against him as Ian loses his footing and begins to fall. As he begins to fall, he sees the mayor reach out to try and take the watch from him. In a split-second movement, Ian pulls the watch back, it clapping into his hand, and he pressed the button that in a normal pocket watch would simply open up the front cover, exposing the face of the clock. In this case, it seemed to slow him down along with everything else. The water that had begun to fall from the sky seemed to freeze in place, his own descent seeming to slow. A frozen figure of the mayor standing over the side of the well, grimacing, with a slick smirk across his face. Ian felt as if he could pull himself up and move. As the watch worked its ways, he felt a burning on his hand. Looked to where the ring began to glow, and something began to click in his mind. The three items he currently carried on his person seemed to harmonize at once. You see that there are items that are fabled to be beyond legendary, to be mythic, to be of legend. Legends of stories and ideas that have been passed down for generations. Now, each of these items by themselves can be considered something of a legendary artifact, unbeknownst of their origins or their purpose. But once you start putting them together, the purpose becomes clear. The ring, the watch, and the book begin to speak to one another. They begin to speak in a tongue unbeknownst to Ian. A deep, guttural tongue that seems to wade between the sound that we can hear and cannot hear. A sound deep enough that it doesn't truly matter what they're saying, because all you can feel is the tone and you know what it's about. The sound that passed through his mind seemed to be of that of the items consoling over what they wanted to do with him. As they saw they were falling to their imminent demise, as they knew that if Ian perished, they would be stuck in this well until another person found them. And that is not what they need. A feeling of great strides passed through Ian as the sounds of the speech from the books and the ring and the watch seemed to fade. He began to feel that he could reach out to an area, reach with his mind, and find himself stepping there within reason. So he tried. In his life or death moment, he tried. He reached out towards the mayor, with his mind placing him outside the well, standing on his own 2 feet, ready to strike the monster that has brought destruction to this town through its own actions. And the items seemed to speak to one another once again, the guttural tones, almost of that of deep throat singing, echoing throughout the well, as the ticking of the watch became louder and slower. As Ian saw a spectral form of himself move forward, behind him leaving a trail of what seemed to be silver strings attaching him to this other self. The other self seemed to simply step across the air in front of him, climbing up the walls effortlessly, finding himself on the outside of the well. In an instant, he felt himself tugged by those very strings, as he was pulled through the same motions his other self took, until he found himself standing behind the mayor. At that point, he believed it was time to strike. He raised his sword above his head and came down upon what was to believe to be the mayor with it. As he began to swing, he heard the ticks of the watch speed up back to normal. As they began to tick faster and return to normal speeds, he saw his sword begin to move as it was no longer trapped in molasses. It became fluid once again. And just in time for the so-called mayor to turn and face the blade of judgment as it came down and struck him at the sword of Damocles itself, splitting him in twain. To keep this in context, this has taken place over the last 20 minutes in the middle of the night, as Ian had found himself walking to the well during his sleep. Now he finds himself with a body in front of him and items that speak to another on his person. As the call to action he felt before, the reason they found themselves in the drowned stone to start with, now seemed to all point to this town, this city, that had one spire in one sister city and one in the other. The region called the Twin Spires. It now was clear in his mind what he needed to do, where he needed to go. But he had to deal with the situation at hand first. He looked down and saw that the body of the mayor had shifted from that of a normal elf to that of a amorphous green and gray creature. These creatures are known as doppelgangers. They kill or replace the person they're looking to take, and they simply live in their skin. In this case, a mimicked version. This one seemed, as Ian put 2 and 2 together, is that this one seemed to have taken the place of the mayor, killing him with his own prized possession. Unbeknownst to him, that the pocket watch left unattended and uncontrolled by someone in charge of it would begin to affect the landscape. The reason the town had become flooded was not because of their own hubris, but because of the fact that the watch was accelerating the time of the stone that would decay and sink back into the ocean. So instead of being above sea level for the next few thousand years, the watch had accelerated the timeline, and the city began to sink quickly below the level necessary to keep the marsh on one side of the landscape. Ian went back to the inn. The landscape now permanently altered, nothing that he could do to fix it. He went back to where the rest of the party was sleeping. He came across that the elf fighter was awake. And they spoke for some time over what happened. As the rest of the party woke closer to the morning, they found that it was time to leave. The town seemed to be in better spirits. The water, from what it seemed, was receding, or being a trick of optimism, as one of the dwarfs called it, as they had been wading through waist-high water since they had gotten there. Always the realist, those two were. So, they finished up their bounties. They collected what rewards they were given for solving the murder and finding out about the murder of the mayor in the first place. So they made their move. They traveled through the dead woods as originally planned and continue moving towards the Twin Spires. I would like to believe that none of them knew what was going to take a turn once they went to those spires, of what was brewing in the world while they were doing their own thing. In the world around them, while they were pulling themselves together and completing what they had for whether either teaching, missions, bounties, or the like, they found that the world around them was changing. A war was brewing. Not between the sister states, thankfully, but between something much worse. You see goblins, orcs, and hobgoblins, and bugbears, and gnolls, and all these different twisted, evil variants of creatures that we've come to know, all seem to follow the same hierarchy. The biggest and the strongest make the rules. So, in that instance, when you become the biggest and the strongest, you begin to change the way people see things. That is unfortunately what came down upon the situation within Twin Spires. Twin Spires quickly found itself in the center of a war they could not contain. They found themselves being assaulted by a force of many hundreds of thousands in size, underneath a singular banner being led by a very large orc. Some deem this an apocalypse. Some deemed this an act of the gods to balance out something behind it. All invaluable insight, but nothing that was truly right. Unfortunately for the twin spires, they seem to have had their communications removed. Their messengers simply killed once they left the city walls. Even those of homing pigeons were not safe from the arrows and nets of the goblinoid orc menace that stood outside their walls. The hyena and wolf-like gnolls, lending their abilities of capture and ranged weapons to deal massive damage to these cities before even the goblinoids approached. Now, you're asking yourself, what is this party of adventurers going to do? It's not what they're going to do, it is why. The situation they found themselves in upon arriving within the Twin Spires was a tricky one. Not only did they have to find their way into one of the cities, thankfully connected by a very long and tedious sky bridge between the spires, but they had to get past the army first. Twin Spires, unfortunately for the party itself, was extremely xenophobic. To be such a city in such a place of magical and different creatures was unheard of. But the Twin Spires were never a set of cities to truly believe in what they believe, the correct idea. The northern city of the Twin Spires was one that was inclusive and open to all. It had merchants, bazaars, and stores beyond the eye can see. It had a wide population, so to speak. The southern city of the Twin Spires was the opposite. It was more militaristic, logistical. That of a isolationist, imperialistic situation. The cities, though living in harmony and balance, did not see the effect they had on the outside regions. So when the army came marching down to take it, a battle that would be felt throughout the land, they found themselves without help and without allies when they needed it most. And that is where the party comes in. Find themselves on the verge of a war, on something that would destroy this region entirely, that would destroy the cities themselves, razing them to the ground. They suddenly had one action: to either get the cities to work together or to somehow break the siege itself. Both of which were very tall orders, even for a party of this experience and prestige. But all they could do was try. They tried to form a truce, a pact between the two cities, an understanding of support and lenience between their two sets of moral codes. Unfortunately, as much as it seemed to be on the end of agreement, one city always seemed to burn the other, so to speak. An argument would spark and words would be thrown, and it would set the whole thing back hours of debate and compromise. The thieves and the rogue and the ranger, while the barbarian, the paladin, the wizard, and Ian, a fighter, stood inside with the noble bodies of both cities, trying to compromise an agreement. The others went out into the wilderness, into the war zone, to find the leaders and tried to break them. Being goblinoids and gnolls and orcs, They knew that if they started taking out the smart ones, the rest would fall because they would begin to squabble amongst themselves. You create enough power vacuums, there's not going to be enough people to fill it, and then everything falls to pieces. It was successful for a moment. They hit a number of commanders that happened to be in the same area at once. The wing of the military that was there seemed to crumble in an instant as those that wanted to be the biggest fought for supremacy, while those that were pushed them down, and a squabble came into play. What they did not anticipate is that the gnolls, being as smart as they were not only the rangers of the military that had been formed here, of this hodgepodge of evil creatures that have come together underneath one banner. They also seem to be the law enforcement and common sense of this military, which is a stretch. It being gnolls telling hobgoblins and goblins what to do, along with orcs. You see, with gnolls, they don't have a hierarchy. They have one person who's in charge, and then everyone else is below that person. So, with gnolls, they saw that their commander, whoever he is, was their alpha. The rest were below him and did what was asked. They would have their, what they called young alphas, which were their team leaders. But otherwise, they stuck to their guns on who was their commander. So when a leader was killed, they did not squabble because they knew that they still had one to fall back to if necessary. So as they began to remove goblins and hobgoblins from the equation to sprout chaos and hopefully ensue issues for the forces that are approaching, they found that the gnolls stopped it at every turn. Why? Who's to truly say? It is unfortunately something that may never be truly explained. But the gnolls themselves kept everything in order, reminding of the goblins and hobgoblins who they serve and why. This put quite the wet blanket, so to speak, on the plans of the forces that moved out into the wilderness. With the compromises falling to shambles and the idea of the rogues, thieves, and rangers falling to pieces, it became clear that they're running out of options. Ever since Ian had gone to the city, the party had known that they were going to be trying to look for something that connects these three items together. Ian could not find it. He was busy with the counseling sessions, with trying to put people together, with trying to make sure everything goes in tune with what is happening and what needs to be done. Past that point in time, it just seemed to be an act of fallacy as they continued to slowly figure out that what was going to be coming around, if the army could not be stopped and the cities could not come together, was going to be the collapse of this region. If this region fell, not only would the military that is passing through here grow stronger from the weapons, the supplies, the support from other factions that roam within the woods and the Deadlands, it would bring forth a significant morale drop for the forces that were stationed around it. Civilians that would try to run would be captured, and it would just end badly for the whole situation at hand. So the party decided to do the one thing they were good at. They were going to decide to fight. How? Our best is the best way we could describe it. There was a choke point between the two cities, where the ground beneath it split. It seemed to be a dry riverbed that led to the gates of both the cities. The city's walls on both the north and south side were relatively thick and relatively impervious to any kind of major attack, minus that of massive siege engines, something that unfortunately, or fortunately for the cities, the army that descended upon them had not created. So it gave them a chance. The party placed themselves in that choke point, becoming almost an example of the Battle of Thermopylae, where they held off waves and waves of these creatures. Magic, weapons, and grit being the only things that stood with them that day. As arrows flew, spells were flung, and weapons were bloodied. They fought and fought and fought for what felt like hours. Exhaustion began to take its toll. As the city squabbled, only small groups of soldiers came out to reinforce the line, to help the heroes who now held it back. They were hoping that after leaving the pressure, they'd be able to get a message out. And thankfully one did. But they did not have days to wait for the message to finally make its way to them. So what were they to do? The biggest issue they found themselves in was the fact that they were running out of time. They were having issues with figuring out of what to do next. Even the strongest heroes have their limitations. And so it looked like some of the heroes began to fall. A few arrows would hit the barbarian in just the right spot to make him wince in pain, take a knee, and be dogpiled by a number of goblins and taken out of the fight. The paladin would be ransacked by gnolls who decide to use their mass against him and pin him to the ground underneath his extremely heavy armor, making him unable to continue fighting, the exhaustion of his body unable to fight back. The ranger would be wounded by a blazing bolt fired from the back of the goblin line by a shaman with a vengeance that would strike them down and they would fall. The rogues and the thief stood strong against the tide as they tried their best. But they are not meant to fight face to face. Even though they can, against the whole army, it is not something they are meant for. So using what items they could, what gumption, what thought, what ideas, threw them to the wind and hoped for the best. Explosives would go off, smoke screens would be strung, alchemy fire would spread, all trying to lessen the encroaching green-skinned horde. The soldiers continued to come out of both towns in trickles. Just not enough bodies to hold back the tide. Ian found himself alone on that front line. The people he had been adventuring with, that he believed to be important to his relative existence at this point in time, seemed to be facing life or death in front of them. He conjured every spell he could out of that book that he found. He used every bit of movement he could with that ring. He even used the watch to give himself more time to try and save his compatriots. But it all became for naught, as he still hadn't found the last item, and he found himself trapped between the walls of a keep and the horde that wanted to breach it. So he did what anyone would do in that situation. He tried. He fought. He pushed. That's all his compatriots ask of him. That's all his mentors would ask of him. His commanders that he served with would ask of him, was to fight. And that's all Ian knew from an early age, was to fight. He did not want to die on that battlefield that day, but he knew that if he could just buy time, that if he could fight to slow them down, it would mean something. And that's what he did. He simply pushed and pushed and pushed, until finally, after exhausting his actions, finally taking the full brunt of the force that laid in front of him, their arrows finally finding the mark, the shorter frontline soldiers getting underneath his shield, finally finding the soft underbelly of his armor, his bag of tricks empty, and his life fleeting. He watched the soldiers that came to reinforce the line begin to fall as well, their actions not strong enough to break the tide that came down upon him. In a brief moment, as he felt the knives find their wounds, as he felt his body begin to give out, exhaustion and blood loss taking its toll, he began to hope that something was going to help. He felt a hand on his shoulder as he laid on the ground, feeling his life leave him. He saw it was the paladin, who simply had reached his arm across the dirt and grasped Ian's shoulder, as he just seemed to be singing a low-worded hymn, as he knew that they were all going to pass. Whether it was a version of last rites or something to help make the passing easier. He sang. He began to hear the other party members who struggled with consciousness themselves sing. And then Ian, through tears flowing over his dust-covered face, found himself singing as goblins and orcs, hobgoblins and gnolls ran across his body and towards the gates of the cities. He felt a cough come through, blood spurting into his hands as he caught it, and he felt his last breath edging closer. He simply raised his hand to the air and accepted what was coming. He accepted his death, something he had fought against for so many years, something he had told was supposed to be fought against. He finally found that if this is where he dies, he needs to accept it. And then in a flash of light, they see the bridge that marks the two spires shatter. The stones falling from their skyline into the dirt below. The large chunks of granite and slate slamming into the ground like large anvils, splattering whoever happened to be unlucky enough to be below them. A glint of silver poked along the sky as it came down and came closer to the party. They all sat there, unable to move, as they saw the stones fall away from them. They saw the army that stood on them, that stood at the mouth of victory, freeze as the bridge shattered and began to crush their front line with the debris. The glint of silver continued to rush down. The gnolls immediately drawing their bows and notching their arrows and firing them at the object, trying to stop whatever is happening from happening. Unfortunately for them, it was never theirs to decide whether it happened or not. Ian felt that same guttural voice begin to echo through his mind. The three items singing that hymn before, of that deep guttural noise that echoed through his head. It seemed to get louder the closer the flash of silver fell to him. In a split second, the silver lands next to him. As he looks, he sees that it is a large, bright blade that is curved ever so slightly and attached to a gilded head of skulls and bones and spirits that are pulled down onto a blackened wood blade that is slightly curved in certain areas to help the person utilize the weapon. As he looks it over, it looks like a farmer's scythe turned war weapon. Something that could be used to swing through hundreds of souls and make it out the other side. The blade landed next to Ian, the handle extending into the sky, and he felt himself reach for it and grab it and pull himself up. With every little bit of strength he had, he pulled himself up until he's back on his own 2 feet, the blade now in his hand, his short sword and shield broken and useless. He picked up the scythe and began to swing it. Every time he swung it, it seemed to cut through the air, almost ringing as if steel hitting steel. Just a high-frequency hum as it sliced through the air, taking goblins, hobgoblins, and gnolls with it with every swing. He just kept swinging, energy flowing into him from somewhere. The blade yearning for the fight, asking for more. And so he continued to swing. From outside his perspective, the party, given a slight momentary release from the problems they find themselves dealing with, are able to pull themselves to their feet, looking over a confused and bloodied force that was recently just trying to take their lives in the city they guarded, but now stands idly by, watching a single man cleave through their ranks with a large black, gold, and silver scythe. The party stared in disbelief. Not to just the stones from the bridge falling and crushing the military that tried to raise it, but the fact that they were all just on their deathbed, and now they feel as if they've been given a second chance. As they see Ian stepping further and further into the crowd, heads, limbs, and otherwise flying through the air as a sickening laugh echoes throughout the panic. His physique began to change as they watched, almost as if his physical appearance was shifting. His clothing grew longer. The coat he wore for simple sake of elementals and for the occasional rainstorm grew longer and began to form him more like a cloak would, its color changing from the deep chestnut brown of nice cured leather and turning almost into a dark satin color of just midnight black with all the lights out and the only thing catching the light being the stars. The designs began to pop around it with silver trim leading the edges and forming into different shapes. His body seeming to not gain in size but seeming to change in height and length. Tattoos appearing all over his body. All over his face, in his hands, in his legs, and his arms, as he continued to fight. Unbeknownst to the party and Ian, is that the items that Ian had consequently found through an act of chance was the 4 tomes or the 4 articles of the Reaper. As is in the old lore, the Grim Reaper himself was a deity that was replaced every few centuries by another person found worthy, or as a host for the spirit. The second thing that none of them were aware of is that when all 4 are collected, the old one shows up. And if you beat him, you get to live. If you don't, you become one of his soldiers. And the cycle continues as he scatters the 4 things to the winds and waits for the next one to show up. As Ian continued to swing and cut through the horde that laid in front of him, time began to slow, and he found himself staring down another shadowy figure that stood across the bodies of the dead that he was knee-deep in. The boss music that he heard in his head that followed him through this whole cacophony faded, replaced by a soft bellowing of the breeze as it passed through the whistling crevasses and stones that laid upon the ground. Ian stared down the avatar of death, the image of the Reaper himself. The Reaper asked him a question of, "Are you worthy of your life?" Ian simply stated, "I've never known the answer to be more than it is now. My life is worth living because it means that if I die, it's for something. And I stand here facing an enemy greater than myself for no reason other than to try and keep someone else safe. My life is worth living, but my death will also mean something." The Reaper smiled at this response, simply raising his weapon and asking Ian to do the same. And they fought. Blows were struck and traded, both became wounded and tired quickly. Eventually, through none other than blind luck, Ian gets the upper hand on the Reaper himself, putting the final blow to him with his own scythe, giving him the title of the new Reaper. With this power, he sees the army broken before him, not due to him continuing his rampage and removing the threats that have amassed along the horizon, but just his sheer presence alone, along with the party that stood behind him. They all, being as powerful as they are, now stand resurrected and ready to continue the struggle, seem to scare the army more than any bomb or weapon could. And so the army retreated. For how long? Unsure. But it left the twin spires at least somewhat sound in the decision to be complacent, to be neutral, to fight amongst themselves while the world continues to turn. After that, the city saved, Ian and the party find their way back home. Ian finds that he can no longer continue. Not because that he does not wish to, but because that he has other duties that lay in line now. That he must go forward and try his best to do something that is worth the time, worth the effort he needs to put in to help those that require it. And so he says his goodbyes. He says goodbyes to a party that has helped him not only find something that he did not know would be of importance as the situation they found himself in. The party not knowing that he would become the reason they keep pushing themselves past the level they currently are. Now, a sibling rivalry coming to form among the members. Ian had learned a number of lessons during that trek, during the 2 years that he served with this party, through thick and thin, through quests and bounties and whatnot. The only few highlights being told here among the fire, as a warning and as a lead to other stories that continue. You see, as the Reaper, Ian had the ability to live a life longer than others. To simply create something that he could live through and continue. And this put him in a particular interesting position, where now he could guide other heroes that wish to grow, much like he did, to become something bigger. And he does do that. As you see, these are not the only heroes in this region that is to be worried about. The other heroes of this region are ones that are meant to be found soon. You see that in this land there are a few interesting conundrums to deal with. You see, there's a crusader without a home, a dwarf that comes from a broken home, a Goliath who has no true meaning, a ranger without a cause. These and others seem to find themselves gathering in a city of Creedmoor, in a region across the ocean from where Ian found himself born into this world and transformed into something more. These heroes would find themselves part of a larger journey that would take them through countrysides and caverns, rises and falls, and would set the tone for what may come as their decisions, their abilities, their choices would shape the world well past their normal lifespans. And so as these individuals found themselves gathering at the tavern in Lombax, finding her way inside to a table that she was told to meet at with the people that were there, a crusader, a dwarf, and a Goliath. They find themselves sitting at a table with ale already in mugs, almost as if it was waiting on them. As they look away from the table to see if they can find their benefactor, a puff of smoke and a swivel of a cloak, Ian finds himself sitting in front of these 4 individuals and simply states, "I have seen where your life ends. Do you want to know where it truly begins? The choice is up to yours. I know that the world will end soon unless you do something about it. The payment will be in riches beyond your wildest imagination. The jobs will be tough, your compatriots tougher, and I will guide you along the way." The 4 of them look at him quizzitively and simply ask, "Why?" Ian looks at them and goes, "You see, I am but a watcher of the threads. I cannot physically intervene, as I am someone who is on the outside of the situation at hand. A demon has arisen by the name of Varen in the desolate wastes. If he is not stopped, the world will continue to end and will never truly heal. This is where you come in. I have seen what you become. I have seen where your life ends. This is where your true life will begin, if you only take the deal." And he holds out his hand to the 4 members, waiting for one of them to take it. The dwarf, in an instant, reaches out and grabs his hand and simply says, "Flingus McFellhammer, ready for action?" The crusader following, saying, "Erder is here to serve." The Goliath following, "Okrin knows good things come to those who fight." And the Lombax simply responding of, "Well, I don't know, but I sure as hell like to find out." With a smile across his face, Ian sits back in his chair and raises his mug to the party in front of him and says, "Welcome. Welcome to becoming a fate breaker. To new friends, to new adventures, and to hopefully a new beginning." And that is where we end our session for tonight. Lovely individuals and viewers. Sleep tight. Sleep well. And we'll see you for another story next week.